On the far edge of the Cornish coast, where the sea carves ancient scars into the cliffs and mist clings to the trees like secrets, there stands a legend few dare to speak aloud. They say 3 towering peacock trees once rose above the forest, beautiful, exotic, and deadly. Some believed they carried a curse. Others swore they were nothing more than strange shrubs blown in from foreign winds. But when Squire Vane, a man of stubborn logic, walked into that haunted grove to prove superstition wrong, he never walked out again. Was it the trees? A crime? Or something far more unsettling, where reason collapses and the unseen begins to breathe? Tonight, we journey into The Trees of Pride by GK Chesterton, a tale where mystery challenges logic, superstition battles certainty, and nothing is quite what it seems. The Cornish coast, in that early spring morning, seemed carved from an older, stranger world, a place where the wind carried stories older than memory, and the sea never stopped whispering its warnings. Squire Vane, lord of the estate, strode across his terraced garden with the briskness of a man who trusted his own judgment far more than the opinions of anyone around him. He was tall, sharp-featured, his white mustache blowing back from a face that carried both cheerfulness and stubbornness in equal measure. Many said he looked like an elderly schoolboy who had never outgrown the idea that challenges existed solely so he could conquer them, and in truth, he often behaved exactly like that. Vane had just finished breakfast under the large garden tree with his daughter, Barbara, a young woman whose copper-red hair glowed like fire whenever sunlight touched it. She watched her father move with the stillness of a statue, her calm presence a striking contrast to his restless energy. The squire insisted on eating outdoors whenever possible, even though the season had barely nudged winter aside. He believed fresh air could cure any ailment, physical or mental, and he rarely missed a chance to prove it. Today, he was on his way to meet a guest arriving by boat. But what should have been a short and pleasant walk from the garden steps down to the small pier became something else entirely. For Vane could never take more than a dozen steps through his own land without stumbling quite unwillingly into the superstitions of the Cornish folk who served him. Cornwall, for all its rugged beauty, was a land thick with legends. Stories of spirits, witches, and ancient curses floated as freely as sea mist. And of all the tales haunting this tiny coastal world, none irritated Squire Vane more than the one concerning the 3 bizarre trees growing on his property. Tall, exotic, almost luminous in color, the Peacock Trees, as people called them, rose high above the surrounding woods like foreign sentinels. No matter where he walked, Vane could feel the eyes of the locals turning toward those trees, fearful, suspicious, whispering the same story again and again. Those trees are cursed. This morning was no different. As he stepped off the terrace and paused to speak with the gardener, the older man immediately launched into a gloomy warning. "These foreign shrubs," he muttered, "they throw the soil out of balance. Nothing grows right with them here." Vane laughed sharply. "Shrubs? Those are magnificent trees. You should be proud of them." But the gardener only replied with a dark proverb about weeds and biblical warnings, making Vane clench his jaw. He was a rational man, proudly so, and he had no patience for nonsense. To him, the trees were simply unusual imports, planted by an adventurous ancestor. Beautiful, perhaps even rare, but hardly supernatural. Yet as he continued his walk, another villager intercepted him. Martin, the woodcutter, stood among the smaller coastal trees, with an axe in his hands and fury in his eyes. His daughter lay gravely ill with the fever that had recently swept through the village, and grief had sharpened his tongue. "If she were strong enough," Martin growled, "I'd move her far from this place. But since we can't move the trees themselves, I swear I'd like to chop 'em down and see 'em crash." "One would think they're dragons," Vane replied impatiently. Martin pointed his axe toward the towering shapes on the hillside. "Look at 'em. Don't they look like something out of those old tales? Something that watches us and waits?" The squire cut the conversation short with an abrupt offer of sympathy for the sick girl. then strode away before his irritation boiled over. But his walk toward the pier, instead of clearing his mind, only intensified the clash between logic and folk belief. Below him, the sea glittered like blue glass. The descending path he followed zigzagged down the cliffside, lined with twisted coastal trees whipped by salt winds into strange, contorted shapes. Behind this natural barrier lay the thicker woods, and rising out of them, the Peacock Trees soared like three unnatural giants. Their leaves shimmered with bluish-green hues, almost metallic, seeming to shift in color as the light touched them. Some said the leaves resembled the eyes of a peacock's feathers. Others claimed the trees emitted an eerie sound during storms, as if shrieking. To the villagers, the trees were not merely foreign, they were unnatural. To Squire Vane, all of it was nonsense. But even he could not deny that they dominated the landscape. The trees stood so tall and so perfectly together that one might almost imagine they shared a single hidden root, branching upward into three trunks, like the arms of some ancient creature buried within the earth. Still, Vane pressed forward, boots crunching over the gravel path. He reached the small stone jetty just as the visitor's boat was mooring. Jake, the fisherman and boatman, gave his lord a stiff, uneasy bow, another dark-eyed member of the same old Cornish stock. His silence felt heavy, almost resentful. Vane brushed it off. His attention had shifted to the newcomer climbing from the boat. Mr. Cyprian Painter, an American critic who had traveled widely across Europe. Painter was tall and slender, pale hair glowing under his white hat, his clothes impeccably chosen despite his long journey. He carried himself with an elegant, thoughtful air, a man who viewed the world not just as it was, but as art tried to depict it. To Painter, the strange landscape, the cliffs, and the eerie trees seemed like something out of a dream. He stared in wonder, calling it a shipwreck on the coast of fairyland. Vane smiled politely, though inwardly he braced himself. The American's admiration for myths and legends would undoubtedly clash with his own no-nonsense approach. Sure enough, Jake the fisherman soon muttered about the trees growing unnaturally well and compared them to a sea serpent that had crawled ashore to feed. Vane groaned, tired of hearing the same fears in different forms. He insisted they continue up toward the garden to introduce Painter to Barbara, but when they reached the breakfast table beneath the tree, she was already wandering along the terrace path above the woods, lost in thought. And it was there, among the shadows of the trees and the glittering sea below, that she encountered the most mysterious figure yet. A shabby, dark-haired young man with a crooked smile, leaning on a black walking stick. A stranger, an outsider, and yet, somehow, not a stranger at all. This meeting, seemingly accidental, would soon reveal connections deeper than logic and more tangled than superstition could easily explain. Barbara Vane moved along the upper terrace of the garden, her steps slow and almost dreamlike, as if she floated rather than walked. The sea wind tugged gently at her copper hair, making it shimmer like living flame against the pale sky. From her vantage point, she could see both the lower path winding toward the woods and the rugged shoreline dropping into blue depths. Though the morning sun shone brightly, Barbara felt a peculiar tension lingering in the air, something she had sensed ever since the villagers began whispering more fervently than usual about the Peacock Trees. It was along this terrace, bordered by a low stone balustrade grown thick with flowers, that she first noticed the figure moving toward her. At a distance, he seemed almost part of the trees themselves, blending with the shadows and light. As he stepped out from a narrow path between the trunks, Barbara realized she had never seen him before, yet he carried himself with an ease that suggested he belonged here in some strange, ancient way. The young man paused below her, tipping his broad hat with a gesture that looked half courtly, half ironic. His dark hair fell in untidy locks around a face that was both handsome and tired, as though he had spent long years wandering through storms. His coat, or rather, what looked like a coat turned into a makeshift cape hung loosely from a single button at his collar. He rested on a black walking stick, one that seemed more theatrical than practical. His smile, faint and crooked, left her unsure whether he was mocking her or merely amused at his own existence. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was quiet but confident. "The squire asked me to call." The statement startled her more than it should have. She was certain her father had not mentioned expecting anyone besides their American guest. Before she could respond, the stranger caught sight of Martin the woodcutter working further down the slope and raised a finger in casual greeting. The familiarity between them made the moment even more bewildering. Barbara tried to steady herself. "Have you come about cutting the wood?" she managed after a pause, though the idea seemed almost absurd. Nothing about this man resembled a laborer or forester. "I wish I were so honest a man," the stranger replied lightly. "No, Martin is the woodcutter. I, on the other hand, cut nothing, not wood, not stone, not even corners." He smiled more clearly now, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "I am, if we must use a word, something like a performer." "A performer?" she repeated, not sure she understood. "Perhaps jongleur is more accurate," he said. "Singer, storyteller, mover of shadows, whichever role the moment requires." The words made no more sense than his appearance, yet somehow they drew her in. There was a rhythm to his speech that felt both ancient and playful. "Do you want money?" she asked without thinking, remembering old tales of wandering minstrels and garden walls. "In the sense that I lack it, yes," he answered calmly, "but in the sense of begging for it from beautiful ladies leaning over balconies, no." His eyes lifted to hers, holding them for a moment that felt too long. Unsure how to respond, she shifted the topic awkwardly to the scenery. He followed her gaze toward the distant trees, and something in his expression changed. The ease vanished. His face sharpened, all humor fleeing like birds before a storm. "There is only one thing in this landscape I'm doubtful about," he murmured. Before she could ask what he meant, he raised his long, black walking stick slowly, deliberately, and pointed it directly at the peacock trees rising from the heart of the woods. The gesture was so stark, so precise, that Barbara felt a shiver run beneath her skin, as though he had struck the trees rather than indicated them. For a brief moment, she felt as though his gesture were a curse. Then, breaking the strange silence, her father's voice rang out across the terrace. "Barbara, we couldn't make out where you'd gotten to." His tone carried its usual bluster, though she detected an undercurrent of concern. She turned instantly. When she looked back, the stranger's posture had shifted just slightly, but enough to reveal a tension beneath his casual exterior. The squire approached with the American guest, Cyprian Painter, at his side, and stopped abruptly when he saw the dark-clad newcomer. It was Painter who recognized him first. His eyes widened with a flicker of surprise and admiration. "Why, squire, don't you know Mr. Treherne, the Cornish poet? I assumed he was already an acquaintance of yours." For a moment, Squire Vane looked almost comically bewildered. Then he recovered, offering Treherne a handshake and a loud, genial greeting, as though the awkwardness had never occurred. Barbara watched the exchange with confusion. That was a poet? The man who had spoken to her like a wandering minstrel was, in truth, the very writer whose name Painter had praised in literary circles. They all began walking back toward the terrace table, where their interrupted breakfast still lay beneath the shade. Painter fell in step beside her, but Barbara's thoughts lingered on Treherne. His strange presence, his cryptic manner, and the way he had seemed both familiar and foreign unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. As they gathered again around the garden table, the squire introduced everyone with a flourish and ushered Treherne to a seat beside Barbara. She felt a flush of discomfort at being placed so close to him. The poet seemed more composed now, but the intensity in his gaze had not faded. It was as if he looked not at her face, but through it, to something deeper, something she was not yet ready to show. Conversation resumed, though with a new tension humming beneath it. Painter asked about local legends. The squire laughed dismissively. Ash, the lawyer, chimed in with dry sarcasm. But Treherne's occasional interjections, part wit, part prophecy, twisted the discussion into stranger shapes. Each word he spoke seemed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the group. Barbara sat quietly, letting their voices blend with the rustling of the trees around them. The sun shone, the sea sparkled, and yet she felt suspended in a moment where something important, something dangerous, had begun to take form. She sensed that the arrival of Painter and Treherne was not coincidence. Their presence, like the whisper of wind through the Peacock Trees, carried a weight she did not yet understand. All she knew was that her father's stubborn certainty, the villagers' fear, and the poet's quiet warnings were on a collision course. And somewhere at the center of it all stood those three strange trees, shifting, shimmering, watching. Barbara Vane sat quietly at the breakfast table beneath the wide branches of the old garden tree, listening to the hum of voices around her as if they drifted from a great distance. Cyprian Painter, their American guest, had taken the seat opposite hers, and though he spoke with courtesy and warmth, she sensed in him an eager curiosity, a fascination not only with the landscape, but with the ancient stories woven into it. He had the attentive eyes of a man who saw meaning in everything, in the crooked path down to the sea, in the strange shimmer of the peacock trees, even in the way the gulls circled noisily above the cliffs. He seemed to look at Cornwall as one might look at an old painting, studying layers of mystery beneath the brushstrokes. Her father, in contrast, had launched into one of his habitual speeches about logic, civilization, and the foolishness of superstition. Squire Vane was in excellent spirits, delighted to have an intelligent guest to spar with. His laughter echoed across the terrace whenever someone mentioned legends or curses, and he took great pleasure in dismissing each superstition as though knocking down a toy soldier. "You see, Painter," he declared, waving a fork for emphasis, "the trouble with this part of the world is that the people here think every odd shape in nature must be a sign from the heavens. If a tree grows tall, it frightens them. If a stone looks crooked, they think it hides a demon." Painter smiled politely, but his eyes shifted toward the woods as if he could feel the shadow of the peacock trees from where he sat. "And yet," he replied gently, "many legends have grown from places exactly like this, wild coasts, strange winds, and ancient memories. Sometimes superstition is just poetry that hasn't yet been explained." Barbara watched her father grin in amusement while Treherne, the enigmatic poet who had appeared earlier, leaned back in his chair with an expression that hovered between sympathy and irony. He seemed to enjoy the discussion, but also to stand apart from it, like someone listening to music unplayed by instruments. Treherne finally spoke. "Poetry and superstition are cousins, perhaps, but so are science and madness. The difference often depends on which one is better dressed." The remark drew laughter from Painter and a snort from Ash the lawyer, who had joined them moments earlier. Ash was a thin, sharp-faced man with a talent for cutting through any situation with a dry remark. He had no patience for mysticism, yet unlike Vane, he did not grow angry with it. He merely poked holes in it like a man pricking bubbles for amusement. Ash tapped his teacup thoughtfully. "What bothers me," he said, "is not that people believe foolish things. That is common everywhere. It's that they believe their foolish things are more profound than anyone else's. Cornwall is no different than London in that respect. And yet," Painter murmured, "there is a peculiar intensity here, something atmospheric, as though the land remembers things the people have forgotten." Barbara found herself studying Painter's face. He spoke with a scholar's calm, yet there was something childlike in his fascination with the landscape, the way his gaze always drifted back toward the woods. She wondered if he sensed, as she did, that the trees held a deeper significance than mere superstition. But unlike the villagers, she did not fear the trees themselves. What troubled her was the way people spoke of them, always with half-formed dread, as though the trees were not just symbols of danger, but witnesses to something unspoken. Her father interrupted her thoughts with a grand gesture toward the hillside. Those trees have become the symbol of every irrational fear in this village. They blame them for illness, storms, bad crops, everything but the price of bread. If one more person tells me those trees are cursed, I shall have them planted at the front gate, simply to offend the superstitious. Treherne raised his eyebrows. You would plant them at the gate? Then surely the villagers would take it as a siege engine of the devil. Let them. Vane laughed. It would teach them a lesson. Painter leaned toward Barbara with a softer voice. Do you also dismiss the villagers' concern so easily? She hesitated. Her instincts were often intuitive rather than logical, and her father's certainty sometimes made her feel as though doubt were a weakness. I don't know what I believe, she admitted. The trees are strange, yes, but not necessarily evil. I think people fear them because they do not understand them, and because fear spreads so easily here. Painter nodded thoughtfully. Mystery can make even an innocent thing look monstrous. Before Barbara could respond, the conversation turned toward the growing unrest in the village. Several workers had become ill, and rumors connected their sickness to the trees. Vane brushed aside such talk with a dismissive wave, but Treherne listened with an expression Barbara could not decipher. His eyes remained fixed on the woods, his fingers drumming softly on the table as though playing out a silent rhythm. What do you think of the matter, Mr. Treherne? Ash asked suddenly. The poet paused, his gaze sharp and strangely distant. I think, he said slowly, that fear, real fear, rarely comes from what is seen. It comes from what is half seen. The villagers fear the trees because they do not know where the fear comes from, and that makes it grow. Vane scoffed. You speak in riddles, sir. Perhaps, Treherne replied with a faint smile. But riddles have been known to reveal truths that simple statements hide. Barbara felt a chill, though the sun shone warmly overhead. She sensed that Treherne was not discussing mere superstition. His words hinted at something deeper, something he understood but was not yet willing to reveal. The table fell into a contemplative silence, broken only by the sound of distant waves and the rustling of leaves above them. A sense of inevitability seemed to settle among them, as though each person felt a shift beneath the surface of the morning's pleasant gathering. The conversations, innocent on the surface, now felt like clues scattered before a storm. Then Painter gestured toward the hillside. Tell me, Squire, how old are those trees, truly? Vane shrugged. A century, perhaps. Imported long ago. Nothing mystical in that. Treherne's voice was quiet but firm. Things imported can sometimes bring more than their leaves. Barbara turned to him. What do you mean? But the poet only looked at her with an expression that was both tender and troubled. Only that the land remembers strangers, and sometimes strangers remember the land. She felt her breath catch, as if he had spoken directly into a part of her heart she did not know how to defend. The moment passed quickly, yet it left her feeling unsteady, as though Treherne carried secrets tied not only to Cornwall, but to her fate as well. What none of them knew then was how deeply those trees, that outsider's gaze, and the whispering belief of the villagers would soon entangle their lives. For the morning sunlight, gentle and golden, was already giving way to shadows that reached farther than anyone imagined. The atmosphere of the countryside shifted perceptibly as the morning wore on, as if a different kind of wind had begun moving through Cornwall, one that carried more than the cold tang of the sea. It carried whispers, it carried fear, and most of all, it carried the restless imagination of a village that had lived for too long under the shadow of 3 strange trees. News traveled quickly among the locals. Someone had seen the squire walking with the American gentleman. Someone else had spotted the peculiar poet Treherne lingering near the woods. And nearly everyone had something to say about the Peacock Trees. Their shimmering leaves were visible from nearly every angle of the lower valley, a constant reminder, like a watchful trio of silent sentries, of tales older than memory. The villagers did not need any special reason to renew their anxieties. In Cornwall, stories did not die. They simply changed shape, like clouds blown across a rugged sky. This week, The shape they had taken was the illness, spreading among the children. Martin, the woodcutter's daughter, lay pale and weak, and though the doctor called it a natural fever, the villagers needed a more symbolic enemy, something they could fear, despise, and, if necessary, destroy. And so, the blame fell inevitably, helplessly, upon the peacock trees. The path that wound past the cottages down to the forest edge crackled with gossip. Women leaned out of doorways with folded arms, their voices hushed but urgent. Old men shook their heads, muttering proverbs that might have been warnings or curses. Even passing fishermen, usually more concerned with storms than trees, cast wary glances at the hillside. It was in the midst of this simmering tension that Painter, Ash, and Squire Vane descended toward the village, hoping to see the woodcutter and perhaps offer some comfort. But nothing in the scene they encountered resembled comfort. The woodcutter Martin stood in a clearing near his cottage, his axe gripped so tightly in his hand that the muscles of his forearm bulged. His eyes were red-rimmed, less from exhaustion than from a fury he could no longer contain. "Our girl's gettin' worse," he rasped, his voice nearly breaking, "and none o' your medicines are doin' a thing." Vane raised both hands in a calming gesture. "Martin, my dear fellow, sickness comes and goes. We mustn't— Don't talk to me about what must or mustn't be," Martin snapped. "It's them trees, I'm tellin' you. Always watchin', always growin', too fast, too strong. There's poison in 'em, poison in the roots, poison in the wind." Ash stepped forward, his tone legal and cold. "Trees do not give children fevers." Martin swung his glare sharply toward him. "Then, explain why the sickness spreads only to those livin' closest to the grove. Explain the dead birds found under their branches. Explain the cow that wandered too near and wasted away." "That cow was old," Vane countered sharply. "Old, yes," Martin shot back, "but not dyin' until the week those cursed leaves fell on her shed." Barbara, who had followed quietly behind the men, felt a tightening in her chest. This raw fear, this desperate rage, was difficult to face. She had seen Martin in gentler moments, laughing with his daughter, carving wooden toys for the village children. But grief had transformed him, hollowed him out. Whether or not the trees were to blame, his suffering was real. Treherne appeared suddenly at the edge of the clearing, as though he had stepped out of some invisible doorway in the woods. His presence drew every eye, even Martin's, though the woodcutter's expression hardened further on seeing him. Treherne gave no greeting. His gaze passed over the group once, lingered on Martin's shaking hands, and then settled on the trees rising in the distance. "You shouldn't be holding an axe when you're this angry," the poet said quietly. Martin's shoulders heaved. "And you shouldn't be speaking of what ain't your business." Treherne tilted his head. "Everything in this village is my business. Everything in these woods. But go on, tell me why today's fears are louder than yesterday's." Martin let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You know why. You feel it, same as the rest of us. Them trees ain't natural." Treherne's face softened in an unreadable way. "Nature has many moods. Not all are gentle." Painter, who had been observing the exchange with growing fascination, finally stepped forward. "But surely," he said, "we can't attribute natural illness to superstition. I've seen tropical trees just as strange in America, twisted, colorful, almost dreamlike. Beauty does not mean danger." Martin stabbed his axe into the ground with a violent motion. "Then you sleep under them trees tonight, stranger. You hear what I hear, see what I see, and then you'll know." The challenge hung in the air like a stone suspended from a fraying rope. Behind Painter, the squire let out a booming laugh that tried and failed to dispel the tension. "We don't need theatrics," Vane declared. "No one is sleeping in the woods. This talk of curses is nonsense." Martin shot him a look of blazing contempt. "Easy for you to say, squire. Your own child ain't burning with fever. You don't have to watch her slip away by inches while them trees tower over us like specters." Vane's expression tightened. He wanted to respond angrily, but Treherne spoke first. "The villagers fear the trees because the trees stand where something else once stood." His voice was low, almost melodic. "Something they've forgotten, but not entirely." Ash frowned. "You speak in riddles again." Treherne didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Martin and reached for the axe, as though to pull it free of the earth. But the woodcutter jerked it away. His eyes flashed with wild, unspoken warnings. For a moment, it seemed as though he might swing the axe, not at the trees, but at anyone who dared dismiss his grief. Barbara stepped forward gently. "Martin, please, no one here doubts your love for your daughter." Her compassion struck deeper than logic ever could. The woodcutter looked at her, and the fury in his face wavered. His lips trembled, but he could not speak. And so, the clearing remained, still charged, electric, as though the very soil waited to choose a side between reason and fear. The wind passed through the branches overhead, carrying a whisper that might have been leaves, or might have been something older, something watching. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The poet lowered his eyes. And somewhere deep within the woods, the peacock trees swayed, their strange feathers of blue-green shimmering in the shifting light. Before this day was over, the village would split into two camps, those who believed the trees were cursed and those who believed the people were foolish. But before this story ended, both sides would be forced to confront a truth far stranger than either superstition or logic. For now, though, the trees only watched, silent, tall, and impossibly alive. Treherne had always seemed an unusual figure in the landscape of Cornwall, as if he belonged to another century entirely, and had merely stepped through a crack in time to linger among the living. To some villagers he was a drifter, a wanderer with more poetry than practicality. To others he was a curious ornament of the region, a man whose words sounded like spells and whose silences felt like riddles. No one knew quite where he came from, nor what compelled him to remain in a place so changed from the old world he seemed to imagine. Yet, on that morning, as tensions surged around the peacock trees and fear rose like a tide, Treherne's presence took on a weight it had never held before. He stood apart from the others, leaning lightly on his black walking stick, his dark coat shaped by the breeze into a silhouette almost too dramatic to be accidental. He observed the arguments of the villagers with a gaze somewhere between sorrow and amusement, as if he had already read the conclusion of a book the rest of them were just beginning. Barbara watched him with increasing fascination. She tried to tell herself she only wondered about him in the polite way anyone might wonder about a stranger, but the truth was more complicated. His manner unsettled her, but not because he was crude or erratic. Rather, he carried an air of quiet certainty, a sense of knowing something he had no reason to know. It was that quiet certainty that made her heart flicker uneasily whenever he looked her way. When the group began walking back toward the squire's estate after the confrontation with Martin, Treherne drifted beside Barbara almost without her noticing. His steps were soundless, his presence subtle but unmistakably near. For a while he said nothing, as though waiting for the right moment to speak. Barbara sensed him studying her gently, not intrusively, and found herself caught between wanting him to speak and wishing he would vanish into the woods again. "You were kind to Martin," Treherne said at last, his voice soft enough that the men ahead of them could not hear. "Kindness is a rare thing when fear enters a village." Barbara glanced at him. "Fear makes people irrational. Fear makes people very rational," he corrected quietly. "Rational in the logic of the heart, not the mind. They fear what seems alive in ways it should not be. They fear what they cannot control." He gestured with his stick toward the distant shimmer of the peacock trees. "And sometimes they fear what they sense, only half-consciously, shadows of memories the land itself hasn't forgotten." Barbara frowned. "You speak as though the trees are part of some ancient story." Treherne smiled, but the smile carried no amusement. "Everything old is part of a story, and everything beautiful carries its own danger, whether men admit it or not." His tone sent a slight tremor through her. Perhaps it was the way he spoke, not dramatically, but with an almost priest-like calm that made his words feel weightier than they should have been. She could not decide whether he truly believed what he said or was simply weaving poetry into daylight. The path narrowed and curved around a bend, and Treherne stepped aside to let her pass first. For a moment their shoulders brushed, and the brief contact startled her with an intensity she had not expected. She quickened her pace, hoping he would not notice. He did. She could sense his gaze, not intrusive but attentively human, and felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Your father is not wrong," Treherne said after a moment, as if choosing his words with care. "People here cling to their fears like armor, but he forgets that superstition is often just knowledge that has lost its name." Barbara hesitated. "Do you believe the trees are dangerous?" He looked toward them again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Dangerous? Perhaps not in the way the villagers think, but I believe the land around them has grown restless." His voice deepened. "And I believe something is coming, something that will ask all of us to choose between what we know and what we only pretend to know." It was not an answer. It was a warning dressed as a riddle. She felt her breath tighten in her chest. They reached the wider part of the path where the terrace began to incline upward toward the house. The squire and painter were ahead, locked in a spirited debate about the differences between American and English folklore. Ash trailed slightly behind them, muttering to himself in that analytical tone he used when constructing arguments even outside the courtroom. Treherne stopped walking. Barbara turned back almost instinctively, though she could not have said why. "Miss Vane," he said quietly, "you must not blame yourself for what you cannot see, but you must trust what you feel. Intuition is not foolish. It is older than reason." The words struck her harder than she expected. No one had ever spoken to her that way, certainly not a stranger. She felt a strange mixture of indignation and vulnerability. Who was he to speak so intimately? "I don't know what you think I feel," she replied defensively. He inclined his head respectfully. "No, you don't know yet, but you will." She wanted to challenge him, to ask him what he meant, but at that moment her father called her name, and she turned away. When she looked back again, Treherne had already moved up the path behind her, his expression unreadable, his presence as elusive as smoke. By the time the group reached the estate again, the tension of the morning had begun to settle into an uneasy silence. The squire continued making confident proclamations about the absurdity of superstition, shaking off the villagers' fears as easily as rain from a waterproof coat. Painter listened thoughtfully, occasionally casting glances toward the woods, as though the trees whispered something only he could hear. Ash seemed more troubled than irritated, making mental notes of the villagers' behavior as if preparing a legal argument. And Barbara felt herself caught between two invisible tides, her father's unwavering rationality on one side, and the poet's cryptic intuition on the other. Treherne walked slightly apart from the group, his silhouette framed against the distant curve of the sea. His face was calm, but his eyes held storms. It was as if he anticipated the unraveling of threads none of them could yet see. The wind shifted somewhere below. The peacock trees moved, not violently, not unnaturally, but with a strange grace, their bluish-green leaves shimmering like the feathers of a giant bird turning in the sunlight. The movement was beautiful. It was also unsettling. Barbara did not know why her heart tightened at the sight, but something deep within her whispered that the trees were not merely plants, nor symbols, nor excuses for village fear. Something was rooted beneath them, something waiting, and without fully understanding why, Barbara realized she was afraid, not of the trees, nor of the villagers, nor even of Treherne. She was afraid because she sensed that the story surrounding the peacock trees was not finished. It was only beginning. Evening settled over the garden like a curtain of violet silk, soft yet full of secrets. The lamps under the trees glowed faintly, their halos blurring into the falling dusk as the small group gathered again around the dinner table. It was Squire Vane's idea. Of course, he insisted that a garden meal, even in the delicate chill of early night, made a man feel alive. And tonight, perhaps more than any other night, he carried himself with the restless vigor of someone determined to prove something to the world. though no one could precisely say what. The American, Cyprian painter, reclined in his chair with the thoughtful ease of a man constantly absorbing details. His eyes wandered between the strange wood, the shimmering sea beyond it, and the flickering lamp that cast wavering shadows over the tablecloth. He had spent the last few days cataloging everything the locals had whispered about the Peacock Trees, from tales of vanishing boys to stories of trees that shrieked like birds in a storm. Now, in the deepening twilight, he shared his newest discovery. "I've come across more legends about your peculiar trees," he said, the edges of his voice carrying a note of wry astonishment. "Apparently these woods don't just make livestock uneasy, they also eat people." Barbara gasped softly, though whether from fear or fascination, even she did not know. Painter explained, with a coolness only an outsider could maintain, that the villagers claimed the trees had swallowed drunks who wandered too close, and boys who climbed too high. "They say," Painter continued, "that a new branch appears each time someone disappears." Squire Vane laughed so loudly that the birds nesting in the hedge scattered in a flurry of wings. "Utter nonsense!" he boomed, scoffing. "Even these people, superstitious as they are, must know better than that. A tree that dines on tourists. Lord, what next?" Treherne, who had arrived late and seated himself in the darker half of the lamplight, spoke softly but firmly. "Nonsense and truth often lie closer together than anyone admits," he said, his tone almost musing. "There are legends of dragons that devour men, yet dragons also poison with breath alone. Perhaps the villagers simply confuse cause and consequence." Ash looked at him sharply. The lawyer had been watching Treherne all evening, as though every shift in the poet's posture, every flicker of his expression, was a new line of testimony to be entered into an invisible courtroom. Treherne continued, "Something can kill without consuming. A fever can be just as fatal as a hungry beast." The squire's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Treherne, not you too. Don't tell me you believe this heathen stuff." "I believe," Treherne replied in the same calm tone, "that fear has roots, and that even roots can move, under the right conditions." The squire rose abruptly, pushing his chair back with a scrape. The wine had warmed his blood, and impatience sparkled in his eyes. "You all seem ready to bow down before 3 harmless foreign shrubs. Well, I'll prove tonight that there is no danger in them, none at all. I'll camp under those trees until sunrise if need be." The declaration struck the table like a thunderclap. Even the doctor, usually imperturbable, blinked in surprise. Painter straightened in his chair. Barbara's fork slipped from her fingers, landing silently in the grass. "Squire," Ash said cautiously, "there is really no reason to—" "No reason?" Vane barked. "My own tenants are whispering that demons live in my trees, and you tell me there is no reason to put an end to this childishness once and for all?" Treherne stared at the squire with a strange, almost resigned expression, as though he had expected this moment far sooner. He spoke gently, but the words were heavy. "Then, do not go alone." That made Barbara's heart stutter. The poet's voice held a tone she had never heard from him before, one of genuine concern. Or was it something else? A premonition he dared not fully reveal. But the squire was too fired by righteous indignation to listen. He snatched his white hat from the chair, jammed it onto his head, and strode down the garden path toward the darkening wood. "Miles," he called over his shoulder, "bring my thick walking coat." But the butler, who had approached silently with plates in his hands, froze. The porcelain slipped from his fingers and shattered. His face, usually unreadable, contorted in something very like fear. The lamps flickered as a breeze shivered through the branches overhead. Painter rose to follow. "I'll keep watch from the garden," he said, glancing at the others. "Better not let him wander completely alone." Ash nodded, but the worry in his eyes deepened. The doctor exhaled slowly, rubbing his brow. "This is reckless," he murmured. "Completely reckless." Barbara took a trembling step forward, her eyes wide. "Father!" she called, but Treherne intercepted her gently. "Let him go," She turned on him almost angrily. Why? Why must he go alone into that place? Treherne leaned close, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Because stopping him now will only drive him deeper into danger. He must believe he goes freely, as a man proving his own certainty. It is the only way. His dark gaze held hers for a moment too long, as if trying to impress something urgent upon her soul that could not yet be spoken aloud. For a moment Barbara wanted to protest again, but something in his expression, a mixture of sorrow, warning, and acceptance, held her silent. She let him guide her gently back to the terrace. By the time she looked back, her father had already vanished into the wood. The night thickened. The moon rose sluggishly behind a veil of clouds, casting a pale sickle of light over the sea. The wind stirred restlessly, rattling leaves and whispering across the grass like something half alive. None of the men spoke. Even the most rational among them seemed uneasy, each caught in his own private thoughts. Painter's analytical curiosity, Ash's calculating suspicion, the doctor's terse vigilance, and Treherne's quiet, unreadable calm. Barbara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and sat in one of the garden chairs, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the dark mouth of the wood. She felt strangely, as though she were watching the opening of a story she had always feared would begin. Time passed slowly. The group tried to converse occasionally, then fell into long silences. The lamps flickered low. The sea murmured distantly. A faint cry echoed once, perhaps a bird, but no one could be certain. It was Treherne who finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "We will know soon." Barbara looked at him sharply. "Know what?" he answered, without turning his eyes from the wood. "Whether the night is governed by reason," he paused, "or by something far older." Before she could question him, the wind rose suddenly, cold and sharp, sweeping through the garden. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the Peacock Trees, something screamed. The cry that drifted from the depths of the Peacock Trees was unlike anything the group had ever heard. Shrill, metallic, and sharp enough to thread through the rising wind like a blade. It echoed across the lawn and seemed to reverberate through the very cliff itself. For a fleeting second, everyone froze. Even the doctor, rational to the point of stubbornness, went rigid as if struck by a sudden chill. Then the sound faded into the rustling of leaves, swallowed almost instantly by the gathering storm. Painter was the first to recover. He rose slowly, gripping the back of his chair. "That wasn't the squire," he said. His voice was firm, yet something in his tone betrayed the tension gripping him. It was too wild a sound. Treherne gave a small, grim nod. "A peacock scream," he murmured, "or something mimicking one. The villagers say the trees make such noises in a high wind." Ash shot him a sharp look. "Must you always encourage superstition?" he snapped. "There's a rational explanation. There always is." Treherne didn't reply. He merely gazed toward the dark archway of branches, his expression unreadable. Barbara leaned forward in her seat, her knuckles turning white against the arms of the chair. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The cry had hollowed something inside her, leaving her suspended between terror and hope. The wind intensified, sweeping across the garden like a living thing. The lamps flickered violently, bending their flames sideways before steadying again. Low clouds raced overhead, revealing slivers of moonlight that spilled pale silver over the cliff edge and the restless sea below. "We should go after him," Barbara whispered at last. "No," Treherne responded gently but firmly. "Not yet." Ash folded his arms. "And why not? You claim to care about the man. You were the one who provoked him into that ridiculous wager." For the first time that night, Treherne's composure cracked. A flash of something dark crossed his eyes, guilt, fear, or perhaps a deeper instinct he had refused to voice. "I warned him," he said softly. "More than you know." "Warnings aren't enough," Ash countered, turning to Painter. "We should form a search party immediately." But Painter hesitated. The memory of that eerie cry still clung to him like smoke. His rational mind urged him forward, yet something older, more primal, whispered caution. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should wait a little longer." If he's wandering inside the wood, we risk confusing him, or worse, driving him deeper into danger. Barbara pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. She hated the logic of those words, and yet she felt an unspoken truth in them too. Her father was impulsive. Charging in after him blindly could make him more reckless, not less. Minutes passed in uneasy silence. The night grew colder. The wind scraped through the branches like skeletal fingers, making the peacock trees shift in the shadows. Their tall forms swayed in the moonlight, almost as if rotating in some slow, ancient dance. Everyone tried not to look directly at them. Painter caught himself staring nonetheless. The trees rose from the heart of the wood like three immense pillars of shadow, their braided trunks coiling together as if carved by some primitive artisan. Their blue-green leaves shimmered with faint iridescence, catching whatever moonlight filtered down. Somewhere deep within, branches rubbed together with a faint rasping that almost sounded like breathing. He shook himself and looked away. Time dragged. Each minute stretched thin until it felt like an entire hour. Barbara's composure began to crack at last. She rose abruptly. "I can't sit here doing nothing. I'm going in." Treherne moved in a heartbeat, gently but firmly blocking her path. "Barbara," he said quietly, "you must not." Her eyes flashed with fury and desperation. "Don't tell me what I must do. He's my father, and you are the only one he would come back for," Treherne answered. "If you vanish too, everything is lost." She faltered. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of collapsing. Treherne guided her gently back into her seat, but her wide eyes never left the blackened hollow where the squire had disappeared. The doctor cleared his throat sharply. "Enough of this. If we allow panic to rule us, we'll accomplish nothing." He glanced at the others with the careful detachment of a physician diagnosing a collective illness. "We give him until dawn. If he has not returned by then, we go in, together." Even Ash, stern and argumentative, gave a reluctant nod. Painter looked at the sky. "Dawn is not far," he said quietly. The vigil resumed. Hours passed, or so it felt. At times, one or another of the men drifted into a momentary doze, only to jerk awake seconds later, heart pounding, unsure whether minutes or hours had slipped by. The night played tricks on them. Shadows seemed to shift. The sea changed tone, rising from a whisper to a roar before settling again. The trees creaked and swayed as the wind battered them. Once, Ash thought he saw a figure move behind the first row of trunks. He stood instantly, staring into the darkness, but nothing emerged. Another time, Painter heard the faintest ring-like metal striking wood, but when he strained his ears, the sound dissolved into the wind. Treherne alone remained consistently awake. He paced along the cliffside edge of the garden, walking beneath the thin line of deformed trees that bordered the sea. His silhouette appeared and vanished between their boughs, like some restless spirit caught in a half-forgotten cloister. Once Barbara thought he whispered something to himself, an old verse, perhaps, or a prayer. She could not tell, and she dared not ask. At one point, a particularly strong gust nearly extinguished the lamps entirely. For a brief, terrifying moment, the garden was plunged into darkness. It felt as though the world had been swallowed. Then the flames revived, trembling back into life. "We're all going mad," Ash muttered under his breath. "The whole countryside must be bewitched." Painter tried to smile, but the attempt felt thin. "We'll know soon." And then, at last, dawn began to bloom. It came slowly, as pale light crept along the horizon, brushing the sea with hues of rose and violet. The black silhouettes of the peacock trees sharpened into clarity, three monstrous shapes, unwavering and silent. The wind quieted. The sea became still, almost glassy. Birds began to stir in cautious chirps, but of the squire there was no sign. Barbara rose, a ghost of herself, and whispered, "He should have come out by now." Treherne paused mid-step. His face was set in a hard, shadowed expression. "Then there is only one thing left," he said. "Someone must go inside." Painter swallowed. Ash straightened. Barbara held her breath. "I will go," Treherne said simply, and without waiting for argument, he turned toward the wood and began walking down the pale ribbon of the cliffside path toward the lion's mouth of trees that waited, dark and silent, for him to enter. Treherne moved down the white curling path with a calmness so steady it unsettled everyone watching him. The pale ribbon of stone gleamed faintly in the strengthening dawn, tracing a delicate line between the cliff's edge and the crooked row of wind-twisted trees. As he walked, the breeze lifted the ends of his dark coat, making him appear almost like a somber figure from some ancient ballad bound for a fate he neither feared nor welcomed, but accepted as inevitable. He reached the dark gap in the wood, the singular entry shaped vaguely like the gaping mouth of an animal, and paused. For a heartbeat he merely stood there, as though listening to some sound only he could hear. Then he stepped inside, the foliage swallowing him in a greenish dimness that clung to him until he vanished fully from sight. Barbara's breath caught. She took a half-step forward before Painter gently placed a hand on her arm. "Wait," he murmured. "If he doesn't return quickly, we'll go in after him." She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the dark void that had consumed both her father and her husband. The garden fell into heavy silence. Not even Ash tried to speak. The lawyer stood stiffly, hands clasped behind his back, his sharp gaze locked on the opening of the wood. The doctor watched as well, but with a different expression, one mixed with grim calculation and something else, more elusive and shadowed. Minutes dragged by, each one stretching itself thin like a thread about to snap. The sun rose higher, casting rays across the sea that sparkled like shattered glass. Birds began to sing again, but their songs felt strangely distant, as though muffled by some unseen curtain. Then, finally, footsteps sounded. They were soft, but unmistakable, the measured tread of a man walking with purpose. A moment later, Treherne reappeared at the woodland threshold. He walked toward them slowly, not in fatigue, but in gravity. Something in his expression seemed altered, tautened by a knowledge he carried carefully in both mind and body. He stopped before the doctor, who stood closest, and spoke in a voice low, but steady enough to carry to every ear present. "He is gone." Barbara swayed, and Painter caught her before she fell. Ash exhaled sharply, as if punched in the chest. Even the doctor's usually impassive face twitched with a faint tremor of shock. "What do you mean, gone?" Ash demanded, stepping forward. His voice, though controlled, had the edge of rising panic. "Gone how? Gone where?" Treherne met his gaze squarely. "There is no trace of him," he said. "No sign of struggle, no sign of flight. It is as though he stepped into the heart of the wood and vanished." Ash opened his mouth to retort, but Painter interrupted, his analytical voice urgent. "Did you search thoroughly, the entire interior?" Treherne nodded. "Every inch the path allowed. The central clearing beneath the trees, the undergrowth, the roots. I searched the ground for prints, torn leaves, broken branches, anything that might show where he had gone. There was nothing, not even his hat." A strained quiet settled again. Painter closed his eyes briefly, remembering the previous day's arguments, the stories of men swallowed by the trees, the rumors of sickness and vanishing, the eerie scream that had echoed through the night. But reason pressed against superstition, as always, and he steadied himself. "Then we'll search again," Painter said. "Together, methodically." "No," Treherne said gently, but with undeniable certainty. "It will make no difference. He is not there." Barbara suddenly stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. Did you see anything unusual?" Treherne hesitated. It was the smallest pause, yet it made everyone lean in unconsciously. "Yes," he said at last. "The birds." "The birds?" Ash asked. "The ones in the undergrowth," Treherne clarified. "They burst upward when I neared the center of the grove. A flock of them, sparrows, thrushes, smaller birds, but they did not scatter like frightened creatures." His voice deepened, as though he were recounting a dream. "They rose as one, as if summoned, and they flew straight upward, toward the central trees. He looked away then, the memory pulling at him. The moment they vanished into the higher branches, the wood went utterly still. A shiver crawled down Painter's spine. The doctor's eyes narrowed behind his glasses. Only Ash seemed angry rather than unnerved. "Birds do strange things," Ash snapped. "That proves nothing." Treherne's dark eyes returned to him. "Perhaps, but the trees were silent. Too silent." "What does that mean?" Barbara whispered. Treherne turned his gaze toward the towering peacock trees that loomed above the forest canopy, their blue-sheened leaves catching the rising sunlight in iridescent glints. "Last night they screamed," he said quietly. "This morning they stood utterly still. No creaking, no rustling, nothing." The doctor pushed up his spectacles, peering sharply toward the wood. "That doesn't signify anything supernatural," he said, though his tone carried less conviction than usual. "The storm was strong, and the wind has died." Treherne nodded without argument. "Perhaps." Barbara suddenly broke into quiet sobs. Painter guided her toward a chair, murmuring consolations that felt painfully hollow. Ash paced the garden with short, furious steps, muttering legal terms under his breath as though they could conjure clarity. The doctor alone remained physically motionless, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the wood with a look that Painter, glancing toward him, did not entirely understand. Sympathy? Calculation? Knowledge? Whatever it was, it seemed tangled. Within minutes, several servants emerged from the house, drawn by the murmurs of distress. They whispered among themselves as they approached the garden, and soon the first waves of rumors began rolling through the estate. "Squire Vane is missing, vanished, overnight. They found no trace of him. Those cursed trees have taken him like the others." It was as if the countryside's old stories had been waiting for this moment to ignite like tinder. By afternoon, villagers were already gathering at the gates, murmuring, speculating, sharing tales of foreboding. The disappearance spread across the region with a speed no rational explanation could restrain. Painter, Ash, the doctor, and Treherne gathered again around the garden table, this time with faces drawn tight by shock and responsibility. Barbara remained inside, resting under the care of the housemaids, but refusing to leave the window that overlooked the wood. "What do we do now?" Painter asked finally. Ash lifted his head, his voice grim with the weight of formal duty. "There must be an inquest," he said. "We cannot delay." Treherne's expression hardened. "And what will we tell them? That he was stolen by trees?" "No," Ash snapped. "We will tell them the truth. That he is missing, likely dead, and that the circumstances are deeply suspicious." The word suspicious hung in the air like smoke. Painter felt something shift then, like the first crack of thunder far beyond the horizon. The mystery of the peacock trees had claimed its first victim, and its story was only just beginning. The days that followed Squire Vane's disappearance seemed to hover in a strange limbo, neither fully real nor fully imagined. The estate existed in a suspended hush, the villagers whispering in clusters along the hedgerows, servants speaking in lowered voices as if afraid their words might disturb something watching them from the edge of the wood. The small group who had witnessed the squire's last steps into the trees remained closest to the epicenter of the mystery, and though they had parted ways that morning after Treherne's grim announcement, none of them could stray far from the house. Painter, unwilling to intrude too deeply into a grieving household, took a modest room at the village inn. Yet every day he found himself wandering the short road that wound upward toward the estate, compelled by an uneasy sense of unfinished duty. He had grown strangely attached to this corner of Cornwall, with its wind-sculpted cliffs and shadowed woods, and the people who carried its burdens. Ash, meanwhile, had temporarily abandoned his London affairs to oversee the legal ramifications of the squire's disappearance. He had returned from town after a brief and fruitless attempt to hasten official proceedings, looking more worn than before. His red hair appeared almost flame-like against his pale, strained face. Yet there was a fire in his eyes, too, the fire of a man who believes he has grasped the outline of the truth, even if the details remain obscured. Dr. Burton Brown had kept largely to himself, visiting his patients with an even grimmer than usual expression. Painter observed the doctor's movements from time to time and felt an odd tension ripple beneath the surface, like a faint tremor warning of a deeper fracture. Something in the doctor's silence struck him as deliberate, calculated. Treherne, now openly living at the great house with Barbara, had stepped quietly and naturally into a new role-head of the estate in all but legal name. It was clear Barbara depended on him for strength, and though Painter could not help but notice a subtle melancholy in Treherne's face, the poet bore it with dignity. The villagers, in contrast, watched the couple with a mingling of awe and mistrust, as though this handsome, enigmatic poet, tied by marriage to the vanished squire's daughter, carried a shadow within him. One evening, Painter sat outside the inn with a mug of ale, the marketplace nearly deserted at that hour. He felt lonelier than he wished to admit. He was used to being surrounded by minds he could spar with, artists and scholars who delighted in intellectual exchange. Now he found himself amid a tale that defied all his usual frameworks, reason and superstition, tangled like threads he could not separate. He had just begun to muse on this when a stranger seated beside him on the bench finally spoke. The man had been staying at the inn for some days, a traveling artist, or so he claimed. With his long, fair beard and tow-colored hair, he looked like a wandering monk who had taken up a paintbrush instead of a staff. Painter had attempted earlier conversations with him, only to find the man curiously unresponsive to discussions of art. But tonight, something seemed altered. The quiet painter turned to him with a faint, almost secretive smile. "I suppose," the man said, tapping the ash from his pipe, "you've been thinking a good deal about the squire's fate." Painter blinked. "In truth, I doubt anyone within 10 miles hasn't." The stranger nodded. "A strange case. Very strange." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been meaning to show you something." He unstrapped his large knapsack and began unpacking its contents. Painter expected sketchbooks, tubes of paint, brushes, but instead, the man produced a thick stack of notes written in black and red ink, and then something that made Painter stiffen, the woodman's axe, wrapped in the familiar linen bandage marked with initials. Painter stared. "That axe? How do you have that?" The stranger smiled grimly. "Because, Mr. Painter, I'm not an artist. Not in the sense I led you to believe." He drew himself up slightly, and his entire manner shifted, his posture straightened, his expression hardened into professional precision. "I'm from Scotland Yard, assigned here by Mr. Ash's request." Painter exhaled sharply. Everything about the man now made a sudden, startling sense. The detached gaze, the vague answers, the lack of interest in art. "So you've been undercover?" "Exactly. And watching very closely," the detective said. "Now that I've gathered enough to start forming a conclusion, Mr. Ash asked me to report directly to you." He tapped the bandaged axe handle. "Do you know what this cloth is?" "Lint," Painter answered. "From one of the doctor's medical rolls." "Just so," the detective replied. "Interesting, isn't it? Especially since the doctor was seen picking up the axe and claimed he'd kept it for Martin's safety. But the woodman tells a different story, one in which the doctor refused to return the axe multiple times." The detective unfolded one corner of the cloth, revealing the clear, inked initials. "T. B. B." Painter swallowed. "It seems incriminating," he admitted. "But," the detective held up a hand, "there's more. Miles, the butler, overheard a violent quarrel between the doctor and the squire not long ago. According to Miles, the doctor said the village would be better off if the squire were gone." Painter frowned. He remembered the doctor's strange composure, his grim silences, his sudden arrival at the cliff path wearing black gloves. He also remembered the way the doctor had insisted on being the one to bring him the grappling tools for searching the well. "And the well itself," the detective continued, "is no well at all. It connects to a contraband cave system beneath the wood, a place where things could be hidden or moved." Painter felt a chill crawl along his spine. "Still," he said slowly, "there are gaps. What of the dried bones? The vanished water? The timing? We haven't solved every thread, the detective admitted. But the evidence, however circumstantial, leads inevitably to one man. The words felt heavy, too heavy. Dr. Burton Brown, Painter exhaled shakily. He didn't want to believe it. He respected the man, admired his dedication to his patients, and yet, something deep within whispered that this case had layers more than even the detective grasped. Before he could ask another question, footsteps echoed. Ash approached swiftly, flanked by two plain-clothed officers. His expression was grim. "We move now," Ash said. "Brown is preparing to leave the village. This is our only chance." Painter stared at him, then at the detective, then at the axe with its damning white bandage. He felt the whole story tilt logic, competing with instinct, reason wrestling with the eerie sense that something larger, stranger, and more ancient than murder was woven into the heart of the Peacock Trees. Still, there was no time to argue. The trap was set. The officers moved into position. In minutes, they would confront the doctor, and whatever truth lay at the core of this mystery, whether human or darkly supernatural, would finally begin to surface. Painter had always believed that reason, if applied carefully enough, could thread its way even through the darkest tangles of confusion. But that belief wavered the moment he approached the mouth of the forest with Ash, the Scotland Yard detective, and two officers keeping close behind. The air itself seemed thick, almost resistant to entry, as though the trees were guarding the secret of what had happened inside them. Even in daylight, the Peacock Trees radiated an uncanny presence. Their trunks, twisted in spirals as if shaped by enormous hands, rose higher than any native species in the region. Their leaves, blue-green and glossy, shimmered with an unnatural glow. Painter felt a faint vibration beneath his feet, perhaps the wind shifting the branches above, or perhaps something else, something deeper. He shook off the sensation. This was no time to surrender to illusions. Ahead of them, the detective pointed toward a small clearing where the ground dipped downward. "There," he said, "that's the spot the squire was last seen heading toward, and, beyond it, the well." The word well still felt like an inadequate name for the strange stone structure half hidden among the roots. When Painter had first discovered it, he had experienced a sense of dread he could not articulate. Now, standing before it again, the dread returned like a pressure behind his ribs. The stones were slick with moisture. The interior was darker than the earth surrounding it should have allowed, as though the shaft swallowed light itself. A faint smell of salt lingered around the edge, a reminder of the sea caves thought to tunnel beneath the forest. Waves could sometimes be heard distantly, knocking against unseen walls far underground. Ash crouched near the edge, peering down. "This is where you found the dried bones," he said to Painter. "Yes, and the water had disappeared entirely, overnight. And now the water is back," the detective added, leaning over with a grim expression. "Full tide. We timed it." Painter looked into the shaft. Something in the water shifted, reflecting light like a moving silver eye. Ash stood abruptly, dusting his hands. If the doctor used this place to hide something, or someone, he wouldn't have been able to access it during high tide. "We must have arrived at the right moment," the detective nodded. "Which means if our suspicions are correct, he'll come here soon. This path shows signs of recent use." Painter leaned closer to the ground. The soil was disturbed, leaves pressed underfoot in a faint but noticeable pattern. A pair of boot tracks, thin, narrow cut through the debris. Brown's tracks. The forest, usually filled with the chatter of birds at this hour, was oddly quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic hush of the wind weaving through the trees, and occasionally the distant boom of waves rushing through concealed caverns. Then, without warning, the detective raised a hand. Footsteps. Everyone stilled. Painter strained his ears. After several seconds, he heard it too soft, steady, deliberate. Dr. Burton Brown emerged from the undergrowth like a figure stepping onto a stage. He was dressed in his long coat, the familiar black gloves covering his hands. A leather satchel hung from his shoulder. Something about the way he held it close to his chest almost protectively sent an uneasy ripple through Painter. Brown stopped the moment he saw them, a stillness so perfect it felt rehearsed. His face did not betray fear, only a deep, weary resignation. "I suppose," he said calmly, "this means you've found enough to accuse me." Ash stepped forward. "Dr. Burton Brown, you are wanted for questioning in the case of Squire Vane's disappearance. You will come with us." Brown's eyes flickered. Annoyance, perhaps, or disappointment. "My dear Ash," he said, sighing softly, "you always were quick to draw conclusions and slow to understand the truth." The officers closed in slightly, forming a semicircle. Brown lifted a hand, but not in resistance. It was a gesture that asked, almost politely, for a moment. "Before you take me," he said, "I ask only that you let me speak." His gaze traveled from Ash to Painter, then to the detective. "If I meant to run, you would not have seen me. I came here to finish something that matters far more than your accusations." Ash scoffed, but Painter felt something loosen in his chest, an instinct he could not push aside. "Speak then," Painter said quietly. Brown inclined his head in gratitude. "Very well, but you must listen carefully, because everything I have done, everything was done for the sake of this village." The detective's eyebrows tightened. "That is a curious justification for murder." Brown did not flinch. "What murder? You expect us to believe the squire's disappearance was accidental?" Ash demanded. "On the contrary," Brown replied softly. "I expect you to understand it was necessary." The words struck like a sudden gust of icy wind. Painter felt the world tilt. Ash took a half-step backward, his mouth tightening into a line of grim certainty. The detective moved forward. "Necessary? Explain." Brown took a breath. It seemed to steady him. "Those trees," he said, gesturing toward the towering shapes behind him, "are deadly. Not by myth, not by magic, but by nature." "We have heard that story," Ash snapped. "But you haven't understood it," Brown returned. "They carry a toxin, something akin to a volatile plant alkaloid. Most people will experience nothing more than dizziness or fever, but a small number, those genetically vulnerable, may suffer severe reactions, hallucinations, organ failure, even death." Painter stared. "You've tested this?" "For years," Brown said simply. "In small ways, quiet ways. I did not wish to cause panic." The detective narrowed his eyes. "Convenient." "Necessary," Brown corrected sharply. "If I had spoken openly, the villagers would have revolted. They would have burned the entire wood, perhaps the estate as well. And Squire Vane, stubborn, dismissive Squire Vane, would have intervened. He would have prevented any action, even if it meant letting people die." Ash felt his throat grow tight. "And so you acted alone." "I acted because no one else would," Brown said. "I needed to prove the danger, and I needed to do it in a way that would force the issue, that would compel this community to remove the trees before they killed again." Painter felt his heart pound. "What did you do to the squire?" Brown met his eyes. "I hid him." A stunned silence fell. "Hid him?" Ash repeated incredulously. "Where?" "Somewhere safe," Brown answered. "Somewhere he cannot leave easily. Somewhere he will not be found until the trees are destroyed and the village is out of danger." The detective's voice darkened. "So you imprisoned him, if you must put it that way," Brown said. "Yes." Ash's face flushed with anger. "That is kidnapping. Criminal insanity. Call it what you wish," Brown murmured. "But it was the only way." Painter stepped closer, voice quiet and trembling at the edges. "You endangered an entire community with a lie." "No," Brown whispered. "I saved them from a truth too dangerous to ignore." Before Ash could argue again, Treherne's voice suddenly rang out from behind them. He had come silently, but his appearance struck the moment like lightning. "Enough," Treherne said. His face was pale, eyes dark with storm. He walked toward them with a steadiness that silenced every man present. "Brown has told you only a part of the truth." He stopped, standing between the doctor and the group. "The rest," Treherne said quietly, "is mine to reveal." Treherne's words hung in the air with a gravity that halted every argument, every breath, every instinct to interrupt. Even the forest seemed to pause, as though the leaves themselves leaned in to listen. Painter felt the tension ripple through the clearing like a tremor inevitable, growing, and impossible to ignore. Treherne stepped closer, placing himself between the captured doctor and the officers. Though he carried no weapon, and though his voice remained calm, his presence was commanding, as if he were claiming a rightful place in the heart of the mystery. His dark eyes flicked briefly to Painter, then to Ash, then finally settled on the doctor. "I know what you've done," he said softly, "and I know why. But there is a larger truth beneath it, one that you," he turned toward the others, "must understand before you condemn anyone." Ash snorted sharply. "Oh, splendid. Another riddle, another poem. This is not a stage, Treherne. A man is missing. A crime may have been committed." Treherne held Ash's glare without flinching. "And that is exactly why you must allow me to finish." The detective, who had been observing Treherne with a professional wariness, lowered his hand slightly. "Speak," he said, "but be aware that anything you reveal may implicate you." "If truth implicates me," Treherne answered, "then let it." He turned toward the trees. Their blue-green leaves shimmered faintly under the filtered sunlight, their tall columns rising like a cathedral built from living wood. Treherne lifted his hand toward them, not dramatically, but with the quiet solemnity of someone acknowledging an ancient monument. "You must understand," he began, "that I have known these trees for longer than any of you, not because I lived here, but because my bloodline did." Painter frowned. "Your bloodline?" Treherne nodded. "My mother was Cornish. My family lived on this land long before the squire ever owned it. These woods, these cliffs, were part of my childhood, part of my earliest memories." He paused. "And so were the stories." Ash rubbed his forehead impatiently. "Stories are not evidence." Treherne ignored the interruption. "There is a legend in this region, not written in books, but spoken from parent to child, and it tells of an old hermit, a man of great wisdom, who lived here centuries ago. His name was Saint Securus." Treherne's voice softened. "He was said to be a healer, a man who protected the villagers from sickness carried by strange foreign plants brought ashore by storms." Painter blinked. "Foreign plants?" Treherne nodded again. "The Peacock Trees grow only in one other place in the world, a remote coastal jungle where they were revered and feared for the same reason, their invisible poison. The hermit recognized the danger. He warned the villagers never to cultivate the trees, but after he died, someone planted new seeds, and people began to fall ill." The doctor closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, as if relieved to hear the truth finally spoken by someone else. "So you knew," Painter whispered. "Even before you studied them scientifically, you knew the legends were warnings." Treherne looked at him with sorrow. "Yes, I learned the scientific truth later, but the old stories hinted at it long ago. Saint Securus dedicated his life to fighting the sickness they caused. He did not destroy the trees. He used his knowledge to keep people away from them. And you believed you were continuing his work," Ash said bitterly, "living in riddles while people suffered around you." Treherne's jaw tightened. "I took precautions. I warned the squire, many times. But he dismissed everything I said as superstition." Ash threw up his hands. "So his disappearance is his own fault? Is that what you're implying?" "No," Treherne said sharply. "What I'm implying is that the doctor and I both saw the danger coming, danger that Squire Vane refused to acknowledge. His stubbornness made him deaf to warnings, and it forced the doctor to create a demonstration that no one could ignore." Brown opened his eyes, meeting Treherne's gaze with gratitude and guilt intertwined. Painter stepped forward, his voice troubled. "But hiding him, why that? Why not force him to see the evidence directly?" "Because," Treherne answered, "the squire would never believe he had been poisoned by a tree. He would believe he had fainted, or stumbled, or had a passing illness, And once he recovered, he would only cling harder to his disbelief. The detective folded his arms. So the doctor staged his disappearance? Brown nodded quietly. I simulated a struggle. I created misleading clues. I knew the tides. I knew the hidden caves. And I hid him where he could not interfere. Painter's eyes widened. Interfere? With what? The removal of the trees, Brown replied. Treherne turned toward the detective and Ash, his expression a mixture of plea and stern resolve. The trees must be destroyed. You must understand that. They are not supernatural. They are lethal. And now that fear grips the villagers, even the squire's return might not prevent further panic or further harm. Ash paced restlessly. This is madness. Trees don't vanish people into thin air. No, Treherne said. But pride does. Pride blinds men to danger. Pride drives them into dark places alone. Pride makes them ignore warnings that could save them. He took a slow breath. The squire was not stolen by the trees. He was taken by a man who feared the trees far more than he feared the law. Brown lowered his gaze. Painter felt everything inside him swirl logic, sympathy, outrage, relief, and something darker, something older, that resonated with the legends Treherne spoke of. He looked from one man to the other, searching for clarity. So where is he now? Where is Squire Vane? Brown's answer was soft. Safe. The detective stepped forward. You will take us to him now. Brown hesitated, but Treherne placed a hand on his shoulder. It's time, Treherne said. We have delayed the truth too long. Ash muttered. And what of the bones Painter found? The hat? The disappearance of the well water? Treherne turned toward him. All staged. Brown used the tidal caves beneath this forest. The squire never descended the well. He was taken another way. Those bones belonged to a man who died long ago, buried in those caves by smugglers. No supernatural force was involved. Ash clenched his jaw. The logic was maddeningly plausible. The detective signaled the officers. Very well. Dr. Brown, you will lead us. Brown nodded, a slow, tired nod. Treherne turned his gaze toward the towering trees once more. Whatever judgment you pass on Brown, he said quietly, understand that he acted out of a desperate attempt to protect lives. In the end, he tried to save us all. A heavy quiet settled over the clearing once more. For the first time since he had arrived in Cornwall, Painter felt that the truth, however strange, however tangled, was beginning to emerge from the shadows. But he also sensed that the story was far from finished, because the forest around them, ancient and shimmering in the morning light, still seemed to be holding its breath. There are moments when truth arrives not like a thunderclap, but like a slow and terrible dawning, a realization that unfurls quietly, gently even, yet leaves the world forever altered. That was how the revelation came to Painter as he left the forest with Ash, the detective, and Dr. Brown. The heavy branches above filtered the sunlight into shifting gold, and each fallen leaf seemed to whisper fragments of a story he had not yet fully grasped. The group had barely stepped into the clearing when they found Barbara waiting. She stood rigidly, her hands clasped before her, her eyes locked on Treherne. Her face carried the exhaustion of sleepless nights and the brittle sharpness of a heart stretched unbearably thin. The moment her gaze met her husband's, something in her expression changed, tightened, deepened, though Painter, standing at a distance, could not yet read it. Treherne approached her with cautious steps. "Barbara," he murmured, but she did not answer. Her eyes traveled instead to the doctor, to Ash, to the detective, and finally back to her husband. "You know where he is," she said quietly. "Don't you?" For an instant, Treherne hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. Barbara's breath caught. The truth had already reached her heart, faster than any explanation could. Painter watched her lips tremble as she swallowed hard. "You've known," she whispered. "You've known more than you ever told us." Treherne slowly nodded. "I warned him. I tried to keep him away, but he was determined to prove everyone wrong. And when I realized what Brown intended, I could not stop him." Barbara's voice sharpened, cutting through the still air. "Why didn't you tell me?" The pain in her words struck deeper than accusation. It echoed with every sleepless hour she had endured, every unanswered question, every moment of waiting in the shadow of the trees. Treherne bowed his head, and for a moment he seemed not the cryptic poet, but a man burdened with the weight of a truth he had carried too long. "Because I was trying to protect you," he said softly. Barbara shook her head, tears brimming. "You should have trusted me." Painter stepped forward instinctively, wanting somehow to mediate, though he knew he had no right to interfere. But before he could speak, Treherne lifted his gaze, and the anguish in his eyes made him appear suddenly older. "I have trusted you," Treherne said, "more than you know. But this was different. I needed to be sure. I needed to understand what Brown planned before involving you in something so dangerous." Barbara's voice trembled with both hurt and fury. "Dangerous? You think the danger was not already mine? My father vanished. The village fell into panic. I have lived in terror for days, and you stood silent." Treherne closed his eyes as if her words struck something tender in him. "I thought silence was gentler than fear," he said. Barbara wiped her eyes harshly, as though rejecting the emotion itself. "No, silence is not gentler. Silence is betrayal." A heavy, painful pause followed. Ash cleared his throat to break the tension. "If," he began, then stopped, seeing Barbara's expression. His voice softened. "Mrs. Treherne, the doctor is taking us to your father now." The color drained from her face, replaced by a wild, urgent desperation. "Take me to him. Immediately." Dr. Brown lifted a hand. "It may be better if—" "Do not finish that sentence," Barbara said, her voice taut with warning. Even Brown, who had weathered more than one confrontation that morning, stepped back at the intensity in her eyes. Treherne suddenly touched her arm, not to restrain, but to steady. "Barbara," he said quietly, "I will take you, I promise. But there is something you must know." She turned, her gaze hard. "What now?" Treherne hesitated, then spoke with the gentleness of someone handing over a fragile truth. "Your father is alive. He is unharmed. But he is not here." Barbara blinked, stunned. "Not here? Then where is he? Where have you taken him?" Brown stepped forward. "He is safe, in a cave network below the cliffs, accessible only at low tide. No harm has come to him. I ensured he had food, shelter, warmth, everything he needed." Barbara stared at him as though she could not comprehend the words. "You locked him underground?" "It was a necessary precaution," Brown said quietly. "He would have interfered. He would have stopped us from preventing further sicknesses." "Stopped you," Barbara corrected sharply. "Not us." Treherne spoke again. "It wasn't just Brown." "I agreed." Barbara gasped. "You?" Treherne's voice broke slightly. "I feared what would happen if the trees were allowed to remain. I feared for the village, for you." Barbara drew back as though struck. Pain rippled across her face, shock first, then disbelief, and finally a sorrow so deep it hollowed her expression. "You knew the danger," she whispered, "and yet you said nothing. You hid the truth. You hid my father." Treherne tried to reach for her hand, but she stepped away. Her voice trembled, but her resolve did not. "No, do not touch me." A gut-wrenching silence fell over the group. Even the forest seemed to dim, the shadows deepening around them. Barbara turned abruptly. "Take me to him. Now." Dr. Brown nodded. "We must wait another hour. The tide is receding. Once it reaches its lowest point, we can enter safely." Barbara's lips tightened, but she did not argue. She folded her arms around herself and stared toward the cliffs, as though willing the sea to retreat faster. Treherne took a cautious step toward her. "Barbara, not another word," she said, her voice soft but unflinching. "For now, silence is all I can bear." Treherne stopped, his face pale and stricken. Painter felt something twist painfully inside him. The poet, so mysterious, so composed, so detached, now stood exposed in his own vulnerability. And for the first time since their meeting, Painter saw Treherne not as a figure from a legend-inspired life, but as a man, a flawed, frightened, human man who had tried to protect someone he loved and failed her in the process. The detective gestured toward the path. We should prepare. The cave entrance will not remain safe for long once the tide begins to rise again. Everyone moved, each step heavy with the weight of revelations. And Barbara walked ahead of them all, her heart fractured, but burning with a single, unbreakable purpose: to find her father and face whatever truth awaited them in the dark beneath the cliffs. The path leading down to the cliffs was narrow and steep, carved by centuries of wind and wandering feet. Now it felt like a descent into the very heart of the mystery, each footstep carrying the group closer to the truth concealed in the ancient caves beneath the forest. The tide was still receding, exposing jagged rocks and slick pools of seawater that shimmered like scattered fragments of glass. The air grew colder as they approached the opening between the cliffs, where the wind moaned through the stone like a mournful instrument. Barbara walked at the front, ignoring the outstretched hands that occasionally tried to assist her. Her dress became damp from brushing against the wet rock, but she did not slow. Her face was pale but resolute, her eyes fixed on the dark fissure where the doctor had said her father was hidden. She looked like someone who had stepped outside herself, beyond fear, beyond anger, leaving only purpose in her wake. Painter followed close behind her, his heart heavy with concern. The cliffs, though beautiful in daylight, now felt oppressive, as if they had been waiting centuries to swallow anyone foolish enough to pry into their secrets. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the salt of the ocean and a faint smell of moss and something older, deeper, something untouched by the sun. Treherne walked a few paces behind them. For once, the poet's usual air of enigmatic composure had faltered. His steps were deliberate, heavy, as if each one required effort. His eyes never left Barbara, though she did not turn to look at him even once. Her silence wounded him more than any accusation could have. Dr. Brown led the way into the narrow stone corridor that slanted downward. "Careful here," he warned. "When the tide rises again, this passage becomes a throat of water. We will have only a few hours." Ash grunted. "A lovely place to hide a man. You must have enjoyed the irony." Brown didn't respond. The doctor's face looked carved from stone, all emotion buried under a layer of grim determination. When they emerged into the first cavern, Painter drew a sharp breath. The chamber was immense, lit only by the pale, greenish glow that filtered in through a crack in the cliff face. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth above them, and the ground trembled faintly with the thundering pulse of distant waves crashing against unseen walls. Barbara stopped so suddenly that Painter nearly stumbled into her. Across the cavern, sitting atop a large, flat stone, was Squire Vane. He looked thinner, his clothes disheveled from his days underground, but his eyes were bright, furious, incredulous, and indignant all at once. His white mustache bristled as he rose to his feet. "Well," he barked, "you've found me. I suppose congratulations are in order." Barbara gasped and ran to him. Vane softened instantly, embracing her tightly. For a moment, the hardened squire melted, his arms closing around his daughter with a protective fierceness that made Painter's chest tighten. But the softness vanished the moment he looked over her shoulder at the doctor. "You," Vane growled, jabbing a finger in Brown's direction, "have committed the single greatest insult ever suffered by a gentleman under my roof. Kidnapping, locking me like a rat in a cellar, all because of your obsession with those blasted trees." Brown stood still, accepting the fury as though he had anticipated it. "I did what I believed necessary." "What you believed," Vane snarled, "was poisoned by superstition. I always said so, and now you've proved it." Treherne stepped forward cautiously. "Squire, please listen. What Brown did was extreme, yes, but he was trying to protect the village." Vane swung around. "And what of you?" he said sharply. "Did you know? Were you part of this lunacy?" Treherne did not look away. "Yes." Barbara, who had clung to her father only moments before, turned sharply at that confession. Her eyes flashed with renewed pain. Vane's face grew red with outrage. Then you are both mad and criminals. Brown lifted a hand. If I may. You may not, Vane thundered. I have endured darkness, damp, bats, and the ramblings of tides thundering overhead like a cursed drum, all because you insist these trees are dangerous. They are, Brown said quietly. Not because of spirits, but because of biology. They're toxins. Enough, Vane roared. When we return to the estate, I will summon every authority in this district and have you both tried for abduction and trespass. Ash took a step forward. Squire, he said in a steady voice, we will indeed need to address the legality of all this. But first, for your daughter's sake, we must understand what truly happened. Painter nodded urgently. Yes, we have evidence of illness spreading in the village, children falling sick, livestock dying, birds behaving strangely, and the trees. What about the trees? Vane snapped. They're not ordinary, Painter said gently, and we have reason to believe they are the cause. The squire's face contorted with incredulity. You too? A man of sense? An American, supposedly rational, falling prey to provincial ghost stories? Painter hesitated, then spoke softly. I've seen enough now that I no longer trust the simplicity of my old assumptions. For the first time, Vane's eyes flickered, not with anger, but uncertainty. A small crack opened in his defenses. Treherne saw it and seized the chance. No one believes the trees are supernatural, only that they carry something harmful, something you, Squire, were too close to see because pride blinds more surely than fog. Vane bristled, but a sliver of doubt remained. Barbara stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremors in her hands. Father, please, come home. Let's hear everything. Then judge. The squire looked from her face to those of the men around him. Their expressions were serious, sober. Even Ash, ever the skeptic, seemed shaken by the cumulative weight of evidence. Finally, Vane exhaled long and slowly. Very well, he said. But if I find even a whisper of trickery left in this affair, I swear none of you will hear the end of it. The group began their ascent from the cavern, but as they reached the mouth of the cave, something happened that stopped them all. A roar, deep, resonant, and inhuman, echoed through the stone. Barbara gasped. The doctor turned pale. Painter felt his heart leap painfully. Vane blinked. What in heaven? Treherne looked toward the sound with a strange expression. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. That, he whispered, is the tide entering the far chamber. We must leave, now. The sea had begun its ascent, and with it, perhaps, came the final warning that time was running out for all of them. The roar of the incoming tide did more than echo it, vibrated through the stone under their feet, a reminder that the cliffs and caverns were living things shaped by the relentless breath of the sea. As the sound grew louder, Dr. Brown urged them forward with a rare edge of urgency in his voice. We must move. The outer passage will flood first. If we delay, he didn't finish. The thunder of water crashing against rock said everything necessary. Barbara tightened her grip on her father's arm, guiding him toward the narrow path that slanted upward. Squire Vane, though indignant and stiff from confinement, moved as quickly as he could. He kept muttering under his breath complaints about imprisonment, indignation about being rescued by the very people who wronged him, outrage that any sane gentleman should be dragged into such melodrama. Yet none of that hid the tremor of real fear beneath his bluster. Painter, moving behind them, glanced back once and saw the rising foam licking at the stones where they had stood only moments earlier. The water glowed faintly in the dim light, as though reflecting something phosphorescent deep within the cave system. It was beautiful in a way, but also threatening, like a predator with shimmered skin. Treherne led the group upward with a sure-footedness that surprised Painter. The poet seemed to know every angle of the rock, every dip in the ground, every place where the stone became slick or crumbly. His voice remained calm as he called warnings over his shoulder. Careful here. The rock is loose. Step to the left. The path is firmer. Don't lean on the wall. It's wet with salt. Barbara followed his directions without looking at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the exit far above, where a sliver of blue sky peeked through the jagged opening. Light felt like salvation now. The detective, trudging behind them with Ash at his side, glanced back at the dark cavern below. "It'll be under 15 feet of water within the hour," he said grimly. "Then let's hope your prisoner's sense of direction is as good as his confidence," Ash muttered, nodding toward Treherne. Brown, climbing beside Painter, exhaled with a hollow bitterness. A pity justice is rarely as swift as the tide. But Painter was barely listening. Something about the cave, its ancient silence, its strange acoustics, its inexplicable dread, had affected him more deeply than he expected. For days now he had struggled to reconcile the rational with the uncanny, but nothing in logic prepared him for how the place made his skin crawl, as if old stories had seeped into the very rock. They climbed in silence for several minutes. Only the pounding sea followed them, rising, chasing, echoing like distant giants pounding on a door. Halfway up the passage, Vane faltered. His boots skidded on a patch of algae-slick stone, and he stumbled. Brown reached forward instinctively to steady him, but Vane recoiled sharply. "Don't touch me," he snapped. "I'm not feeble." Barbara steadied him herself. "Father, please," she whispered. "Let's get out of here before any of us drown." Vane grumbled something unintelligible, but he leaned into her support. Treherne paused until they caught up. His eyes flicked to Barbara, full of concern she refused to acknowledge. Finally, after what felt like a long and harrowing climb, they emerged into daylight. The sudden brightness made them blink and shield their eyes. The sky spread wide above them, blue and streaked with thin clouds. The sea roared below the cliff, spraying mist over the jagged rocks. They stood on a narrow ledge that wound along the cliff, face wide enough for a single person at a time. The wind whipped their clothing and tore at their hair. Far below, the water churned with white foam, rising slowly but inevitably. Squire Vane inhaled deeply, savoring the open air. "Thank God," he muttered. "I was beginning to think I'd die in that accursed cave." Brown stepped a safe distance away from him. "You were never in danger," he said quietly. "Not in danger?" Vane barked. "What do you call being imprisoned under a cliff, chased out by the tide, and forced to scramble up a mountain like a goat?" "Necessary," Brown answered, "and temporary." Vane turned purple with outrage. Ash, noticing, quickly directed the group onward. "We should reach the upper path before the tide closes this route. Save your arguments for solid ground." They followed him carefully, each step deliberate. Painter helped Barbara over a sharp protrusion of rock. She offered him a strained smile, gratitude mixed with exhaustion. Treherne trailed behind, giving her space but watching her carefully, as though bracing for another fracture in her resolve. When they finally reached the top of the cliff, the tension broke physically, if not emotionally. The grassy plateau stretching before them felt welcoming, soft underfoot. The estate gardens were visible in the distance, their bright flowers starkly at odds with the shadow of everything that had occurred. But rest was short-lived. Villagers had gathered near the path, dozens of them, their faces tight with worry and superstitious dread. Some whispered prayers, others crossed themselves, others simply stared, pale and fearful. When the group emerged, especially when they saw Squire Vane alive, a ripple went through the crowd. "He's back! The squire! He's alive! Blessed be!" Then the trees didn't take him, but relief quickly collided with confusion. Old Mrs. Cray muttered shakily, "If he weren't taken, then who's to blame for the sickness? For the shrieks? For the bones in the well?" The murmuring grew louder, swelling like a restless tide. Voices trembled with long-suppressed fear. "The trees. They're cursed. They must be cut down. They're killing us." Barbara stiffened. Treherne glanced at her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the crowd. The detective raised his hands. "Quiet! Let the squire speak." Squire Vane stepped forward, still weary, still disheveled, but his pride rising like a shield. He was ready to unleash a tirade about imprisonment, injustice, and the utter foolishness of country superstitions. But he never got the chance, for at that moment, a child, pale and trembling, staggered into the clearing. Her mother followed, sobbing, "It's the fever. It's worse. 3 more children took ill this morning." The crowd gasped. Women clutched their shawls. Men exchanged grim looks. The doctor stepped forward instinctively. "Let me see her," he said, kneeling beside the child. But the villagers recoiled. "You knew," someone shouted. "You hid it from us," cried another. "You let our children suffer." The mob surged, voices rising. Fear was no longer a whisper. It was a wildfire. Treherne stepped between Barbara and the encroaching villagers, his expression sharp. Painter felt the entire countryside tilt into chaos. Squire Vane lifted his cane with fury. "Enough! All of you, shut your mouths and listen." But the villagers weren't listening. Brown straightened, his voice breaking through the uproar. "The trees must be destroyed, now, before more people die." His declaration hit the crowd like a bell toll. For a moment, silence. Then the villagers began to move, not with panic, but with grim resolve. Torches were lit, axes were lifted, ropes were gathered. The march toward the Peacock Trees had begun, and none of them, not even Brown, could stop what came next. The crowd surged like a tide of breathless desperation, moving toward the forest with torches glowing angrily in the gathering dusk. The Peacock Trees, still distant, yet towering in their eerie blue-green shimmer, seemed to watch the approaching villagers with silent, indifferent majesty. They had stood for decades without disturbance, but now an entire countryside marched against them, driven not by myth alone, but by fear sharpened into certainty. Squire Vane tried to reassert control. He raised his cane high above his head and attempted to shout down the wave of panic. "Stop this nonsense at once. You have no authority to damage property on my land." But his voice was swallowed by the storm of voices around him. "They're killing our children. They're poisoning the air. They scream at night. My husband heard it. No more death. Down with the trees." The torches flickered violently in the wind as the mob pressed forward. Women clutched talismans or rosaries. Men held axes, saws, and lengths of rope. Even elderly villagers hobbled forward, driven by a fierce, almost ancestral urgency. Barbara stayed close to her father, though her expression was torn not between sides, but within herself. She had grown up under those very trees, seen them from her window every day, and part of her clung to the belief that something so beautiful could not be monstrous. And yet she had seen too much illness, too much fear, too much truth emerging from shadows to dismiss the danger entirely. Treherne, walking beside her, watched the scene with a grave, troubled, calm. Painter, unable to shake a sense of grim inevitability, stayed near the poet, both of them alert for signs of collapse, either of the crowd or of the fragile unity holding them all together. As they approached the forest's edge, the trees loomed larger, their trunks winding together like columns in some forgotten temple. The sunlight filtered through their iridescent leaves, casting shifting patterns across the ground that seemed alive, almost pulsating. The strange beauty of the trees stood in stark contrast to the fury advancing toward them. The village blacksmith lifted his torch first. "We start with fire." "No," Dr. Brown said sharply. He pushed through the crowd, his voice rising above the clamor. "If you burn them now, the toxins will spread through the smoke. Do you want everyone here choking to death within minutes?" A shocked murmur spread. The villagers hesitated. Treherne nodded in support. "Brown is right. Fire will not save you. It will kill you faster than any illness." The blacksmith lowered his torch reluctantly. "Then what do we do?" "Cut them down," Brown said, pointing at the nearest trunk. "Bring them down piece by piece. Quickly, before nightfall." The villagers murmured again, this time with grim resolve. Men with axes stepped forward. The first blow landed with a deep, resonant thud. Chips of blue-tinged bark flew. A sound like a groan rolled through the forest, as though something ancient and immense had stirred in its sleep. Barbara flinched. What was that? Treherne answered quietly. The wind through the branches. Nothing more. But even he didn't fully believe his own words. The cutting continued. Each strike was accompanied by the labored breathing of desperate men and the steady chanting of villagers who had turned fear into ritual. The leaves rustled above them with an uncanny shimmering, as if rejecting the violence done below. Painter stepped back, trying to view the scene with the clarity of an outsider. But clarity eluded him. Something about the trees, something he could not explain, felt too alive, too aware. Then came the whisper. Not human, not bird, not wind. A soft, rippling sigh that traveled from branch to branch, trunk to trunk, like a message passed in a language none of them understood. Several villagers dropped their tools with startled cries. "They're speaking! The trees are speaking! It's a curse!" "No," Brown snapped. "It's the gust, a pressure in the wood fibers natural." But his eyes flickered anxiously, betraying his own uncertainty. Squire Vane, shaking off the last of his shock from the cavern ordeal, strode forward with renewed fury. "Enough of this hysteria," he barked. "They are trees, not demons." But the villagers had gained momentum. The chopping intensified. Ropes were fastened around the smallest of the trunks. Men strained, pulling as the wood began to crack. At last, with a rumble and a shattering groan, the first peacock tree toppled. The ground quaked as it fell. A cheer erupted, but it died almost instantly. For as the tree landed, its trunk split open, exposing a core of strange, darkened fibers that released a faint but unmistakable scent, sharp, chemical, burning the nose. One of the men staggered backward. "What is that smell?" Brown inhaled sharply. "The toxin. It's been inside the wood all along." Treherne closed his eyes briefly, as if hearing the echo of a centuries-old warning. St. Securus's caution about foreign plants brought by storms, plants that hurt the land even in their beauty. The villagers recoiled, their fear now confirmed as physical reality. "Keep cutting," Brown urged. "Do not touch the core. Do not inhale deeply. Work fast." Men tied cloth around their faces. Others poured water on the exposed wood to keep the fibers from dispersing further. The second tree fell more quickly. It hit the forest floor with a force that sent birds screaming into the sky. And then came the third tree, the tallest, the central pillar, the one the villagers feared most. As they hacked at it, Painter felt a sharp tremor beneath his feet. The ground quaked once, twice, then stilled. He said nothing, but unease prickled at the back of his neck. Barbara, watching from the edge, clutched her father's arm. Vane stood rigid, watching the destruction of his favorite ornamental grove with a disbelief that bordered on grief. At last, after blade upon blade, after ropes strained and men shouted, the final peacock tree shuddered. A deep crack split its trunk. The entire forest seemed to draw a breath. With a roar loud enough to shake the hill, the last tree fell. Silence followed thick, absolute, disturbing. The villagers dropped their axes. Some knelt in exhausted relief. Others hugged one another, half laughing, half crying. Brown exhaled shakily. "It's over." Treherne, however, remained motionless. "No," he said softly. "It has only begun." Painter turned sharply to him. "What do you mean?" Treherne nodded toward the broken remains of the third tree. Deep within the exposed trunk, something glittered, a dark, sapphire sheen, unnaturally crystalline. "The roots," Treherne whispered. "We must see how deep they run. The sickness may not be ended until every part of it is removed." But before they could respond, a distant shout rose from the bottom of the hill. A single villager came running, breathless, wild-eyed. "The water!" he cried. "The well is rising, rising fast. The tunnels are flooding." Painter felt dread slam into him like a blow. The tide was no longer a distant threat. It was coming for them, at full speed. As we reach the end of this journey through the trees of pride, we're left with far more than a mystery solved or a superstition dispelled. Chesterton's tale reminds us that the world is rarely divided neatly between reason and myth, between what we can measure and what we can only feel. Sometimes logic blinds us as deeply as fear does. Sometimes ordinary people sense truths long before scholars dare to name them. And sometimes the bravest step is simply to look again, closer, deeper, without prejudice. In this story, every character wrestles with their own version of truth. The squire clings to rationality. The villagers trust their instincts. The poet sees hidden meanings everywhere. And the doctor fights to separate fact from fantasy even as he manipulates both. Yet, beneath all their arguments and discoveries lies one powerful idea, that understanding the world requires both courage and humility. We must be willing to question what we believe and to accept that not everything fits neatly into our frameworks. If this tale stirred your imagination, challenged your thoughts, or made you look at the world with a little more wonder, then I invite you to continue exploring with us. Havelin Storytime is dedicated to bringing classic literature, forgotten gems, and timeless mysteries to life, one story at a time. So, if you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. There are countless more worlds waiting to be discovered, and we'd love to explore them with you. Until next time, keep reading, keep imagining, and keep wondering.